The buckboard came into Red Flint on one broken wheel, screaming hard enough to turn every head on Main Street, and Sheriff Gideon Thorne stepped off the boardwalk on his one good leg before anybody else moved. He caught the rail with one hand and the driver with the other. The jolt slammed through his shoulder. The horse at the traces rolled wide around the eyes. The man on the seat was Asa Pember, county clerk, and blood had soaked half his vest. "They took Mrs. Pike," Pember rasped, clutching Gideon's sleeve. "She copied the wire." "Hollis knows." A brass key slid into Gideon's palm, slick with blood. "Church box," Asa whispered. "Don't let him take the valley." His hand fell away. People spilled from shops and saloons. Someone breathed the same thing Red Flint had been saying since Gideon came back from the rail bridge explosion with one leg gone below the knee. "He cannot ride fast enough." Gideon did not answer. He gave 2 short whistles. The iron-gray gelding tied outside the jail lifted his head at once. Ash had come to him half wild, rib-thin, bad-eyed, and angry at the whole world. Gideon had gentled him with dawn work, a steady hand, and long silent hours. The horse came light to voice, lighter still to a knee. He understood Gideon's crooked balance better than most people understood straight speech. Gideon mounted in one smooth motion. "Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight, and if you feel like it, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. There is comfort in knowing who is riding beside a story like this." Then he leaned over Ash's neck and went west. Heat still clung to the flats, though the sky was already dimming lavender beyond the ridges. Dust coated the back of Gideon's throat. He read the trail as he rode. 3 shod horses, 1 mule, fresh weight on one saddle, not its own. Men moving fast. 1 mount fighting the bit. Nora Pike. He had not said her name aloud in months. Not since spring, when she handed him pie at the church social, and both of them stood in a silence shaped like the man they had buried. Daniel Pike had been Gideon's deputy and best friend. 3 years earlier, a powder charge hidden under the rail bridge had sent timber and iron into the river. Daniel died there. Gideon lost his leg. Nora lost the life she had expected to grow old inside. Now she had been taken because she saw something she should not have seen. At the first fork, Gideon left the road and cut through a dry wash. He had trained Ash for bad ground. Shale, creek beds, cedar breaks, steep banks where a heavier horse would balk. The outlaws had distance. Gideon had a horse educated in harder truths. He found the first of them at the lined shack above Widow Creek. The door hung broken. Smoke drifted from a kicked lantern. A chair lay splintered near the stove. On the floor, one of Nora's hairpins caught the last light like a dropped sliver of moon. From the arroyo below came the rough sound of men laughing. Gideon slid from the saddle, took the rifle from its scabbard, and dropped into the wash. 2 men stood there beside the mule, one drinking from a canteen, the other pawing through a carpet bag. Neither heard him until he said, "Step clear." The older one reached for his gun. Gideon fired once into the dirt by his boot. "Next one goes through bone," he said. The younger outlaw ran uphill. Gideon let him. The one who stays is usually the one who talks. "Where is she?" The man's eyes flicked toward a split in the rock wall. Nora stood in the shade there, wrists tied in front of her, cheek bruised, chin lifted as though the ropes offended her more than the danger. Gideon cut her loose. "Your clerk died for a copy wire," she said. "I hope you mean to make that expensive." "What wire?" "Hollis Rusk ordered the bank in Cheyenne to call every widow's mortgage in Widow Creek due by Saturday. Not because they owe, because he wants the valley cleared before the herd buyers come through." The outlaw spat. "You don't know what you're saying." Nora turned toward him with that bruised face and said, "You tied me to a chair and still couldn't teach me stupidity." Despite the smell of smoke and sweat and gun oil, Gideon nearly smiled. "Where are the notes?" "With Buck Clevenger. Riding north." Buck was Rusk's foreman. Quick with a pistol, quicker with a lie, and mean in a way daylight never improved. Gideon glanced at Nora. "Can you ride?" "I can do most things if the alternative is Hollis Rusk." He put her on the mule to save Ash's wind, and they cut for town under a sky turning iron blue. The mule stumbled twice. Each time Nora cursed it in a schoolteacher's tone that made Gideon think of neat copybooks and children trying not to laugh. They reached the cottonwoods above Red Flint just as the church bell began to ring out of rhythm. A body swung from the nearest limb. Asa Pember turned slowly in the last of the light, his shoes twisting over empty air. Below him stood Hollis Rusk with 6 mounted men and half the town gathered around the water trough. Rusk wore a dark coat without a speck of dust on it, silver watch chain against his vest, face arranged into public sorrow, so polished it nearly shone. "There he is," Rusk called when he saw Gideon on the rise. "Sheriff found quick enough once the killing was done." Murmurs spread. Gideon saw Calvin Sneed beside him, deputy badge glinting. Sneed had a neat little mustache and the habit of smoothing his cuffs after ugly work. There was blood on one cuff now. Nora drew breath to speak, but Rusk cut across her voice. "Mrs. Pike's shaken. No shame in it. A man murders a clerk, drags off a widow, and the poor woman may say anything to steady herself." "You liar," Nora snapped. "But fear is lazy. It prefers the version that asks nothing of it." Townsfolk looked from Gideon's wooden leg to the hanging clerk and settled into the lie that cost them least. Sneed raised his rifle, climbed down, and surrender. Gideon looked once at Asa, once at Nora's bruised cheek, once at Rusk's easy mouth. Then he made the choice that burned the bridge behind him. He fired at the bell rope. The bullet snapped it. The bell gave one crazed last clang as Ash lunged downhill. Nora drove the mule through the gap between 2 horses. Shots cracked. Bark burst from the cottonwood. Then creek water hit cold up Gideon's boot, and they were through, racing into the dark flats while Red Flint roared behind them. By midnight, Hollis Rusk had a dead clerk, a frightened town, and a one-legged sheriff named Outlaw. By midnight, Gideon Thorne had Nora Pike, a brass key, and nowhere left to stand except in the truth. They took shelter in an abandoned sheep camp south of town, a low stone hut smelling of old wool and dust. Gideon rubbed Ash down before he let himself sit. "You're bleeding. It's a scrape. It is soaking your shirt." She boiled a little water, cleaned the furrow along his arm, and wrapped it in strips torn from a flour sack. The room smelled of singed dust and carbolic soap. Up close, the bruise on her jaw had gone yellow at the edges. "What exactly was on that wire?" Gideon asked. Nora tied off the bandage. "An order to honor seizure on 37 mortgage notes, all belonging to widows or old homesteaders in Widow Creek. Asa kept duplicate ledgers in the church poor box in case of theft or fire. That key opens it. Proof, if they lived long enough to use it." Nora sat back against the wall. "We could ride east before dawn, reach Fort Sanders by tomorrow night, hand everything to a federal marshal." Gideon stared at the candle flame. If they took it, Rusk would own Widow Creek before any marshal finished his breakfast. Families would wake to seizure papers nailed to their doors. Good people would lose the water that kept them alive. "Auction Saturday," he said. "Yes. If we leave, he wins first." Outside, Ash stamped once in the dirt. A coyote called from the ridge, thin and lonely. Nora's voice came quiet. "Are you choosing the county over your own neck again, Gideon?" He did not look at her. "Last time I chose wrong. Daniel paid for it." That sat between them. At last she said, "Daniel paid because wicked men laid powder under a lawful bridge." I waved him forward first. "You think grief makes you the only one with memory?" She folded her bruised wrists in her lap. "My husband rode where you rode because he believed in the same things you do. If you spend the rest of your life crawling from that truth, you shame him worse than Rusk ever could." He looked at her then. She had buried a husband, kept a school open, and endured a kidnapping without once speaking like the helpless woman Rusk imagined he had taken. There was more steel in Nora Pike than in half the men who wore guns. He said, "Then we stay." She nodded once. Not triumph. Recognition. At dawn they went to the chapel. It stood north of town among leaning graves and tired cottonwoods, white paint peeling in long curls. Gideon pried up the floorboard beside the altar. Under it sat a tin lockbox damp at the edges. Inside lay the duplicate mortgage ledger, 3 telegram stubs, and a packet tied with blue thread. Nora opened the packet first. "Receipts," she said. "Payments from Hollis Rusk to Calvin Sneed for security services." Gideon took one of the telegram stubs. His jaw locked. The land survey attached to it had been revised the week after the bridge explosion, rerouting the county access road straight through Rusk's range and making him the only legal crossing for cattle buyers. The blast that killed Daniel and crippled Gideon had not been random outlaw spite. It had been business. Nora saw it in his face. He planned profit on top of the graves. For a moment, all Gideon heard was bridge water and splintering timber. Then he folded the survey once, very carefully, and slid it into his pocket. "This breaks him," Nora said. "If we live to read it." The town did not make living easy. By noon, Red Flint had boarded itself up with fear. Men who had drunk coffee beside Gideon last week crossed the street rather than meet his eye. Curtains twitched. Doors stayed shut. Yet not everybody bent. Mrs. Vickers at the boarding house let them in through the coal shed and pressed biscuits into Nora's hands without a word. Ephraim Cole, the blacksmith with the whistle through his front teeth, hid Ash behind the forge and said, "Your horse looks smarter than this town. I'll trust his judgment." Outlaw stitched Gideon's arm tighter and muttered, "Rusk's purse has grown too fat for his soul to carry." Loyalty came in whispers. Fear rode openly. Late that afternoon, Nora sat with Gideon behind the forge, the ledger spread across a flour barrel between them. Hammer blows rang through the walls. Ash dozed in the shade beyond. "What happens," she asked, "when people finally see the truth and it arrives too late to mend what it broke?" Gideon watched the gelding flick flies with his tail. "Then you mend what's left and call it a life." It was a small line. It barely rose above the hammering, but it settled into her face like rain into thirsty ground. Near sundown, word reached them that Hollis Rusk had moved the auction forward to first light. He was not stealing land now. He was hurrying daylight itself. And let me ask you this, because by now you know the measure of these people. If you had a chance to run and save yourself, would you take it, or would you stay and fight for folks still too frightened to stand beside you? They had one night left. Rusk spent it trying to burn them out. Ash warned them first, head high, nostrils wide. A heartbeat later, bullets smashed through the forge wall. Wood splintered. A horse screamed. Ephraim's hammer rang once on a man's skull. Gideon fired through smoke and sparks. One rider pitched from the saddle. Another turned and bolted. Buck Clevenger came through the front, hat gone, pistol low. Gideon dropped, rolled, and felt heat cut the air where his head had been. He came up on one knee and drove his shoulder into Buck's middle hard enough to send them both into the quenching trough. Steam burst up. Buck clawed for Gideon's throat. Gideon hit him with the brace of his wooden leg. Once. Twice. The third strike loosened Buck's grip. Across the forge, Nora snatched a dropped branding iron from the coals and swung it at the rider coming through the side door. The man howled and stumbled back, coat smoking. Outside, Calvin Sneed shouted, "Set it alight." Lamp oil hit the planks. Flame climbed. "Back way," Nora cried. They burst through the rear lean-to into the alley where Ash already stood saddled, because Ephraim Cole knew trouble when he heard it breathing. Gideon mounted. Nora swung up behind him. He could feel her heartbeat through his torn shirt. They shot into the dark with fire at their backs and riders fanning after them. This was where Ash became legend. He ran low and long, not wasting emotion, stretching over the moonlit flats as if the earth had been made smooth for him alone. Gideon guided him by knee and voice, both hands free for rifle and rein. They cut through a creek bed, up shale, over a cattle gate. No horse had business taking that fast. One outlaw tried the inside turn at Bitterbrush Cut and lost both saddle and pride to loose rock. Another buried his mount chest deep in the mud at Willow Crossing. A third nearly closed the gap until Gideon sent Ash up a bank only a horse trained to trust crooked weight would climb. By the time they reached Mission Creek, only Buck and Sneed still followed. The bridge there was old and half-rotten, river running black beneath. Gideon did not slow. Ash hit the planks and thundered across while nails shrieked under his shoes. Behind them, Buck cursed and tried to follow. The center beam gave way. Horse and rider crashed into spray and timber. Sneed hauled up on the far bank, white-faced in the moonlight. "You can't outrun a warrant forever," he shouted. Gideon turned Ash in a tight circle and called back, "Maybe not, but I can outrun you." Sneed fired once. The shot went wide. Gideon and Nora vanished into cedar shadow. They did not stop until dawn laid a gray wash over St. Agnes Orchard, abandoned years ago when blight killed the apples. Sweet rot still lingered faint in the packing shed beams. There, with the storm finally past enough for pain to return in proper order, Nora helped Gideon to the floorboards. He almost refused on habit. Then he saw what the night had cost her. Soot at her throat, hem torn, hands shaking only when she thought he was not looking. Ash stood outside blowing hard. Gideon rubbed the gelding's neck until the muscles stopped jumping under his palm. "Good boy," he murmured. Nora managed a tired smile. You talk to him sweeter than you talk to most people. Most people haven't earned it. Neither had he, when you found him half-starved and mean. Gideon poured the last clean water into his hat for the horse. He was never mean, just waiting for somebody not to hit him. The words hung there larger than the animal they described. Nora sat on an overturned crate, morning light finding the gold in her brown eyes. Daniel used to say that about you. Gideon went still. He said people mistook your quiet for hardness. Her fingers laced so tightly her knuckles blanched. After he died, I could not bear your face. Not because I blamed you, because you carried the last piece of him still walking this earth, and every time I looked at you, I had to lose him again. He sat opposite her, no more than a pair of boots and 3 years of silence between them. I thought staying away might make it lighter. You made it lonelier. Truth sometimes lands so clean there is nothing to do but take it. She reached into her carpet bag and drew out Daniel's old pocket knife. The bone handle was worn smooth from years of use. She laid it in Gideon's palm. I carried it because it proved my old life happened, she said. But I think he'd rather it be used than mourned. Gideon closed his hand around the knife. It was warm from hers. Strange thing about broken lives, Nora said quietly. They don't mend where you expect. They mend where someone finally holds the torn edges still. He looked up at her. Some lines are heard once and carried forever. That was one. When he reached across the space and laid his hand over hers, she did not pull away. If this story is moving you, you are exactly who it was written for. A like and a subscribe tell us to keep bringing these long roads, these hard-won mercies, and these people who refuse to stay broken. Warmth came then, but not safety. Down in the valley, dust plumes were already rising. Rusk was gathering men for the auction. Gideon stood. We end it today. Nora rose with him. Yes. They rode into Red Flint just after noon. Rusk had turned the courthouse steps into a stage. A warped table stood there with the mortgage notes stacked on top. To one side waited Calvin Sneed, wrist bandaged, badge still shining. Below them stood 37 Valley families, wives in washed calico, old men with hats in their hands, children told to stay close and quiet. By county authority, Hollis Rusk was saying, properties in arrears will be transferred to lawful holders of debt. Lawful. The word rolled off him like oil. Then hoofbeats sounded from the south road. Heads turned. Gideon and Ash came in at a hard, controlled run, Nora on the mule just behind. They pulled up so close to the steps that Ash's chest nearly touched the bottom riser. Rusk smiled as if greeting an inconvenience he meant to enjoy. Sheriff, bold of you to attend your own disgrace. Gideon's voice carried over the square. Auctions unlawful. The notes were called on forged authority. Asa Pember kept duplicates. He held the ledger high. Rusk's smile thinned. A dead clerk's notebook proves nothing. Then maybe your receipts do, Nora called. She raised the blue thread packet, and something changed in the crowd. Sneed lunged first, pistol in hand. Gideon had been waiting for it. He kicked Ash sideways. The shot cracked past his shoulder. At the same instant, Nora slapped the mule's flank and sent it straight between Sneed and the table. The mule hit the corner hard enough to spill mortgage notes into the dust. Widows bent and snatched them up. Rusk cursed and reached for Nora. She was already on the steps. She spread the ledger on the table and raised her voice with all the authority of a woman who had spent years making children listen. Mortgage Note 14, Ruth Ellery, paid through August. Note 19, Samuel Boone, paid in full last winter. Note 23, Martha Vickers, cleared by cash and labor exchange, witnessed by Asa Pember. That's mine, Mrs. Vickers barked from below. Nora turned another page. Telegram stub to First Plains Bank. Proceed on immediate seizure despite standing payments. Deliver originals to H. Rusk. Murmurs broke into voices. Voices rose into anger. Rusk saw it turn and did what small men do when truth corners them. He chose violence. He seized Nora by the arm, jerked her against him, and jammed his revolver under her jaw. Everything went still. Back, he snapped. Gideon dismounted slowly. He kept his eyes on Rusk's hand, on the tremor beginning at the thumb. Let her go. Rusk laughed, but there was a crack in it now. You think a cripple and a widow can take a county from me? Gideon took one step forward. No, I think the county's taking itself back. Rusk dragged Nora down the steps toward his horse. For one hard second, Gideon thought fear might win again. Then little Ben Harker, all of 12 years old, ran into the street holding one of the scattered notes above his head. "This says my grandma paid," he shouted. "You lied." It was such a small voice. It broke the spell. Men moved. Women moved faster. Ephraim Cole stepped out and brought his hammer down on Sneed's wrist. Mrs. Vickers stamped Sneed's fallen pistol under her heel. Outlaw shoved 2 ranch hands toward Rusk's horse. The square woke up all at once. Rusk fired into the air and heaved Nora across his saddle. Gideon was already on Ash. They tore north out of town, past the mill, past the water trough, out over the hard flats where heat shimmered and every hoofbeat sent up the smell of baked sage. Sneed tried to cut across from the alley. Gideon leaned, caught the deputy by his coat collar, and ripped him clean from the saddle as they passed. Sneed hit the ground and stayed there. Ahead, Rusk looked back once. He saw the distance closing. He saw the one-legged sheriff he had mocked for years coming on like judgment, and something in his face finally understood the shape of its own mistake. He turned toward Dead Mule Wash, hoping rough ground would favor panic. It favored the better horse. Ash gathered himself and flew the first cut bank. Rusk's mount stumbled and lost ground. Nora twisted hard and drove an elbow into Rusk's throat. His grip loosened. Gideon drew even, reached across open air, and caught Nora by the waist just as she threw herself free. The transfer nearly unseated them all. Ash surged forward with Nora behind Gideon, breathless and clutching his vest. Rusk might still have escaped then. The old Gideon would have let him go, grateful to have saved the woman and the proof. But the harder road had made a different man. He rode Rusk down in the wash. Not by luck, not by miracle, by the very thing Rusk had mocked. A horse trained by patience, a body forced to learn balance the cruel way, and a sheriff who knew every bad inch of county ground because pain had taught him to study where he placed himself. Ash came alongside. Gideon rose in the stirrup of his good leg, caught Rusk's coat collar, and hauled him backward. The cattle king hit dust in a burst of grit. His gun flew clear. Gideon dismounted with Daniel's knife in one hand and grief in the other. When Rusk scrabbled for a rock, Gideon pinned him face down instead, wooden leg braced hard between his shoulder blades. "Look at that," Rusk wheezed into the dirt, Law pretending to be merciful. Gideon bent close enough for only him to hear. "No, mercy would be letting you keep your lies." They brought Hollis Rusk back to town on foot, wrist bound with his own silver watch chain, because Nora said rope was too decent. This time the crowd did not part for him. It closed. By sunset the truth stood in the square where fear could not stuff it back in a drawer. Nora read every forged note aloud. Outlaw swore to the blood on Sneed's cuff. Ephraim testified to the attack at the forge. Mrs. Vickers produced payment receipts from her sewing box. One by one, folks found their voices and discovered they had not lost them after all. Hollis Rusk lost faster than he had ever taken. Within the week his accounts were frozen, his surveys voided, his ranch lands seized to pay restitution and penalties. Calvin Sneed lost badge and freedom together. Buck Clevenger, dragged half-drowned from Mission Creek by cowhands who no longer feared his employer, traded confession for prison instead of the gallows. Widow Creek stayed in the hands that had watered it. As for Gideon Thorne, the town that had doubted him had to learn the long, embarrassing discipline of gratitude. It began awkwardly. Men tipping hats they should have tipped sooner. Women leaving pies on the jail windowsill without notes. Children following Ash down the street as if he were half horse and half fable. Gideon accepted it all with the mild confusion of a man more comfortable earning trust than receiving it. Nora made the learning easier. She moved the schoolroom into the brighter side of the church by autumn, and most evenings, after the last child had gone home, she carried her ledgers to the jail porch and sat beside Gideon while Ash grazed near the hitch rail. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they listened to crickets and let company do what words could not. By winter her hand was in his when the first snow came. By spring there was no point pretending Red Flint did not understand what it was seeing. Months later, when apple blossoms began trying again in St. Agnes Orchard, Gideon and Nora rode there with a basket, Daniel's knife, and no grief left between them that had to be carried alone. Nora cut bread on the crate where she had once confessed her loneliness. Gideon poured coffee black as stove polish and said it was too weak just to hear her laugh. Ash stood under the paling trees with his reins loose, old scars silvering through his coat, content as any creature ever gets. Folks say a hard life makes a person smaller. Sometimes it does. And sometimes, if mercy catches hold before bitterness does, it leaves room enough for another heart beside your own. From the rise above the orchard, you could see the valley green with rightful water, the town roof lines shining after rain, and one gray horse grazing near two figures seated so close their shadows had become a single shape in the falling light. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf woman sent to a remote ranch because her family was ashamed of her, and the blind rancher who saw her worth from the first moment he heard her footsteps on his porch.